So for the next step in our workshop, we are going to be exploring blueprints. And what blueprints let you do is create a template smart contract um, that you can then reuse to deploy new copies, new instances of that contract with different parameters. Right. So the blueprint pattern will have two sides. One will be the pattern contract, the template contract, the actual blueprint. And the other one will be the factory contract, which will let us deploy new instances, new copies of that blueprint with every time different constructor parameters. Um, so you may say, well, like if you, before we've created an ERC20 token, a regular one, and we had to deploy it ourselves. And so if we want to create a new token, every time we would have to redo that deployment process, which is kind of complicated, right? You need to have a dev framework, you need to use the command line, or maybe your IDE, like if you're using Remix, will allow you to do it, but it's still quite a cumbersome process. If you're using a Blueprint factory contract, by contrast, what that lets you do is to deploy contract as a regular transaction. So the real difference is, in order to deploy a contract, your user could just go to a website, click a button, and then the transaction would show up in that user's wallet. They would approve it, pay a little bit of gas, and the transaction itself will deploy the contract. Right, so in terms of user experience, this is a lot better. You don't have to actually get people to write any code or deal with the complexity of a smart contract deployment. It's just one single transaction that you can approve in your wallet. And so this is the type of pattern that we're going to be using for our agent. So first, let's start and have a look at the actual blueprint. So this is going to be the template contract that we're going to be deploying many instances of. And so this contract, if you look at the code, it's roughly similar to the ERC20 token contract that we had before. The main difference you'll see is that the constructor now takes on a number of arguments. And then here we, oh, sorry, this is the token factory. Sorry, token blueprint. There we go. Right, so here is the former constructor, and here we passed the name, but we hard-coded all of those values, the symbol, the name of the token. Here in our blueprint, we're going to be flexible. We're going to let, right, all of those values are going to be passed as arguments to the constructor. Right, so this means we can reuse this contract, and when we initialize it, we're just going to pass the name, the symbol, and all of that as arguments to the constructor. And so we can basically deploy this contract with any name and symbol that we specify. So this is our blueprint. And then we're going to make a factory contract. So here, our factory contract is going to have, what the factory is going to do is that it's going to be using the init code that is stored in the blueprint on chain, and it's going to redeploy a contract that copies it. And so for that reason, we need to have the address of that blueprint contract, right? Our ERC20 implementation, right? So we're gonna make this an immutable variable. So we're gonna, once we deploy the token blueprint, we're gonna get the address, and the next step, when we deploy the factory, we're gonna pass the address of the blueprint onto the factories for the factory to store it. And then our factory is gonna have a function called deploy token, right? That's an external function, so anybody's gonna be able to call it. Right? And this function is gonna take a name, a symbol, a number of arguments that we are then going to pass on to our blueprint contract. Well, through the built-in function create from blueprint. Right? And so what create from blueprint does, right, is really deploy a contract using the init code that is stored here at the implementation address, at the blueprint address that we specified before, right? And then it's going to invoke the constructor with the arguments that we passed, right? So create from blueprint here is going to create a new version of this contract on chain with the name and symbol and decimals that we passed on, right, as we call deploy token. Right? And then the return value is going to be the address of that new token. And so we can do this as many times as we like. Right? We can deploy as many tokens as we want, and every time the factory contract is going to deploy on chain a new contract. Right? So that's pretty cool. You can use it for right. So for example, dexes. Right. If you're building a dex, you can use this to deploy your new pools. Right. Because your pools will all have a fairly similar. Like they'll all have the same code. Right. So you can use this to let your users create new pools. Here, we're going to use it to let our users create new tokens. It's a way of letting your users deploy smart contract without actually having to deal with the deployment process. You're passing on all of the deployment as a transaction to their wallet that they can approve, right? So those are our contracts, and now we're going to need to test them as well. Right, so we're going to create fixtures for them, just like we did for the token contract before. Here, token blueprint. We're going to need to deploy it as a blueprint, right? The deployment process of a blueprint contract is a little bit different because we're not actually going to call the constructor, right? So we're going to deploy it as a blueprint contract. We need to use the special function here, deploy as blueprint, to make sure that it's not deployed as a regular contract. So that's going to be our blueprint. Right? Remember, we've imported those before here. And then we're going to have another fixture for our factory. And the factory here, that's a regular contract. So that's going to be deploy. And then we're going to pass on the address of token blueprint, right, to our token factory constructor. Right? Remember, because we want to store as part of the token factory the address of our ERC20 blueprint, so that when we create from blueprint here, we can pass on that address. Right. So we've got our fixtures set up here, token blueprint, token factory, and now to write on our test, what we're going to do is we're just going to create a bunch of tokens, right? So here we'll have just a couple, but every time we'll use deploy token from our factory contract, and we're going to create, the name is just going to have incremental values based on I. Right, so every time it's going to create a new token with a different name, different symbol, and the token is going to get deployed. And here, what we're doing with token blueprint dot deployer dot add is loading it as a Vyper contract object, right? So this will allow us to call the function. So it's a bit similar if you were using web3.py, right? It's a bit similar to creating a contract object and passing the ABI. Right? But here, like again, we don't really want to store the ABI anywhere or whatever. This is a util function from Moccasin via BOA, which is what Moccasin uses under the hood, that lets us get a contract object that will have all of the contracts function without specifying the ABI, right? We can actually get it from our dev environment because we've got the contract here. All right, so token blueprint.add, and then we can call the blueprint, call the name function and the symbol function to make sure that the token that we've deployed actually does have the same name and symbol that we specified. when we called the deploy token function on the factory. Right, and so here we can run this new test. We're going to copy this, and this one's going to be token factory. And this time we are testing the factory, and we're just going to run it. Right, and our test has passed. Right, so we've learned to deploy Blueprint contracts, which you can use if you want to make something to let people create NFT collections. Right, that's another thing you could use the Blueprint factory for. Instead of having people create their own NFT contract and deploy it, you yourself would make the NFT module, the NFT blueprint, and your users would only have to specify, maybe to pass on a list of URLs to the pictures, names, the number of items in the collections, and that will allow them to deploy their connections without actually having to write anything.